But what coaches may have found is that to propel their business forward is they're providing more coaching information out there. And with that comes more growth of the sport. So in terms of weightlifting coaches, they'll either have to go through other schools of coaching, like kind of like what you're doing, like you're trying to find mentors essentially, or like information out there. But it's not that hard to find information for powerlifting to get good at coaching. If you really wanted to, you can find a ton of information like that.
Hey team, I'm here with Dom from Weightlifting and New Zealand Powerlifting Academy. Just to get started, Dom, would love to hear a little bit about your backstory, how long you've been coaching for, what kind of athletes do you have, what kind of spread?
Hi, I'm Dom from New Zealand Powerlifting Academy and Central Weightlifting Academy. So I've been coaching since I was 16, so more than half my life. I've been coaching all sorts of sports, youth sports, a whole bunch of sorts. I don't know, cricket, rugby. So cricket, rugby, everything. Because like I used to work as a youth sports coach, where we'd go to primary schools, and we'd coach would take basically take their PE. So a whole bunch of certs for that. But one of my main ones obviously is weightlifting and powerlifting. And that's kind of been my main business now since I've moved away from the workforce. So I've been coaching weightlifting since 2012, like a little bit longer than that, but actually competing, which is when I would consider coaching. 2012, what was that now? 2024, right? And then so weightlifting first, and then powerlifting. So my background actually was like I did a little bit of MMA back in the day, and then CrossFit. And CrossFit was quite unpolished at that time. It was like 2009, 2010, so it wasn't as polished as it is now. So I got drawn more into like more established coaching, which is weightlifting, powerlifting, and just been kind of doing that since.
Yeah, nice. So how long have you been powerlifting coaching for then? So you've done 12 years of weightlifting. When did you kind of make that hop across?
So in 2000 and late 2012, basically I got more clients for powerlifting than weightlifting. The cost of entry for weightlifting is a lot greater in terms of learning curve, in terms of like requirement for coach. And then I started getting like a lot more powerlifters. And in 2013, we had Commonwealths here in New Zealand for powerlifting. And it just so happened that I was coaching a handful of good lifters, and then they ended up representing New Zealand for that. And then that kind of kickstarted my career for powerlifting, and kind of known more for powerlifting now than weightlifting.
As a coach and athlete who's done both, which would you say the superior sport is?
In many aspects, I would say as a sport, I would say weightlifting. It's got history. It is more athletic, um, but with history comes a lot of other baggage, I would say. Right. In terms of trajectory in future, I would say powerlifting is in a lot better trajectory. And cost of entry is a lot easier to get into. You'd literally pick up like a YouTube channel and then learn how to squat, bench, and deadlift. Most people squat, bench, and deadlift in their training anyways. And then if they get a good coach, they can progress up. Obviously, now we have our world championships, a lot more prestigious. Whereas, if I'm being honest, the world championships and Olympic games have been a lot more tainted of recent, with all the tests, positive tests that they've been running into. And also after world champs, we now have Sheffield, where athletes can earn a lot more money afterwards. And that's kind of where we just came from in February.
Yeah, it's so cool. I'm definitely really excited to see what powerlifting does as a sport. Obviously, it seems to be on the way up, and weightlifting maybe seems to be a bit of a declining or dying sport. Do you think that there's anything weightlifting can actually do to maybe turn that around or make it a bit more like powerlifting on that upward trajectory? Do you think it's just too far gone at this stage?
I don't think it's too far gone. I think the culture is set though. like I said, like with heritage and history comes culture. So one of the things that I believe has actually worked really well for powerlifting that weightlifting kind of does a little bit of, but not as much, nowhere near as much as powerlifting, is the culture of coaching. And like what I mean by that is like having more coaching information out there. So because of how low the barrier of entry is for powerlifting, people can get in, like I said, like through YouTube or something like that. But what coaches may have found is that to propel their business forward is they're providing more coaching information out there. And with that comes more growth of the sport. And weightlifting doesn't really do that. Um, there are some coaches like I don't know, Tellender off the top of my head, or like that are trying to do that. Um, who else was it? The Max Aida was trying to do that a little bit with. Yeah, they're trying to do that, but nowhere near the level of powerlifting, the amount of information for powerlifting. So in terms of weightlifting coaches, they'll either have to go through other schools of coaching, like kind of like what you're doing, like you're trying to find mentors essentially, or like information out there. But it's not really not that hard to find information for powerlifting to get good at coaching. If you really really wanted to, you can find a ton of information like that. Whereas in weightlifting, you have to try hard to get to these coaches that are experienced, and a lot of them would hold their cards, closer to chest, kind of, and not kind of give the information. And I think that culture went a long way in terms of propelling powerlifting forward really, really quickly. Um, World records broken all the time because you get a lot of upcoming coaches. They'll learn from other coaches that are trying to position themselves as point of authority in the market by providing lots of information. And then they take all this information and then they put their own spin on it. And then the sport just develops super quickly because of that. Like, and that's kind of just from a coaching standpoint. From an athletic standpoint, um, it's just easier to get into. Like I said, like you could be just a gym normie and you're probably benching, you're probably squatting, and then it's not a hard transition to the squat, bench, and deadlift.
Mm. That's fair. I mean, as someone who coaches Olympic weightlifting, obviously there's not a lot of good, easy, digestible information out there. For people who wanted to get good at weightlifting, what are the let's say the top two or three top tips that you would have for people starting in the sport as fundamentals or basics, so that they can end up, progressing in a decent way without it being a really convoluted and difficult sport? Because as you said, powerlifting is quite easy to find information. It's quite easy to get results. Obviously, coaching and the culture of coaching is one thing, but Olympic lifting is also quite technical and difficult. Are there any really simple places or simple things you would say people should start thinking about in the early days to make their life a lot easier to get to be a more established lifter in that sport?
I suppose it comes down to also in defense of the weightlifting coaches, like not putting a lot of information out there. A lot of it is because you can't just put generic information out there because of how complex weightlifting is. You can't just say you have to do A, B, C, even though you don't know where the person's coming from a positional standpoint, from an experience standpoint. So in defense of that, that's why maybe a lot of coaches hold their cards dear to their heart, because their cards might not be applicable for everyone. And in saying that, that's probably the first place I'd start, is find a good coach. Um, that's like a big conversation to have in terms of like what a good coach essentially is, because in my opinion, like to find yourself a good coach, it's like an experiential good, it's an experiential service. It's not something that you will find the value of before you purchase the service. You'll find the value after you purchase the service, and after a little while as well, not just immediately after you purchase the service, right? It's not a Corvette, it's not like sexy and everyone wants to, like you don't want to purchase a coach that way. Purchase a coach like a house, like something that you will only see the value of like after living in it after a little while, and you won't know exactly what you're getting. So that's like quite difficult, but I would say finding a good coach and like having a good process when it comes to finding a good coach, instead of just being like, oh, that person's popular, oh, he seems a bit smart, like, or maybe it's just like, oh, that person's got like heaps of good lifters, or whatever it may be. Like, it's a lot more, like I said, like an experience based service that you won't really truly know the value of until you have one. And it might be a case where initially you'll pick a coach, and then you assess, and then you move or you stay. You don't really want to keep moving coaches all the time, but you really, really can't assess how good of a coach someone is, like, on first glance, or yeah, or even by just reputation. You just can't.
Sure. So we've already talked about this a little bit. Obviously, Small Goods is a gym that really likes to concurrently train weightlifting and powerlifting. Totally understand that there are sacrifices made in doing that. But as someone who's coached high level weightlifters and high level powerlifters, if you were trying to make someone really capable at both sports, how would you go about it? Would you encourage them to train seasonally? Would you have a certain amount of one and a certain amount of the other in a given program? Like, if you were trying to make someone a national champion in both sports, or as close to as you possibly could, how would you approach that over a given year, given 5 years, and a given 10 years?
um I would not, but I have. Ironically, so I have coached someone to, in within the same year, win a national championship here in New Zealand, for both weightlifting and powerlifting. But that's very, very rare. Not because I'm capable. It's just like that was in 2018, I would say. But the sport is growing so much that you can't. No, I'm not gonna say that. It's Nothing's impossible. um, you shouldn't uh, you should prioritize, essentially. Like, a lot of what we did today was about priorities, right? um, there might be someone that can do both, maybe in an age category, national champion in both, or something like that, or really good at both. But really, I feel like, and this is me being like a, how would I put it, we call it like a Puritan, I suppose. Sure. Like, I feel like it's a bit of a disrespect to trying to do both, and expecting to be great at both. Now, you can do both and be above average at both. You can be good at both. You could be, for sure, competent at both. You could qualify for nationals. You could potentially podium for nationals. But to expect yourself to then be like, oh, for weightlifter that would train like 9 times a week, and then also like a power lifter would train, I don't know, 3 to 5 times a week, and then try to put that into one person and expect yourself to basically beat that person, beat those two individuals. It's a little bit of, not arrogant, I wouldn't say, like a little bit overconfident to believe that you can do that. I just wouldn't, because I just accept that, it's probably, is it fool's errand? Is that the right term for it? Yeah.
Okay, I've probably voiced that wrong. Let's reconsider the way that I voiced that question, because I probably didn't get that one right. Obviously, the pinnacle for some people would be to go to worlds, maybe win a world title if they're doing just powerlifting or just weightlifting. Let's say that you've got someone who really enjoys doing the mixture of both sports. Obviously, being a national champion is probably a very hard thing to expect, if not impossible. As you say, the sports are only ever growing and it's getting more competitive, so it would be silly to think that that's going to happen and it's going to be realistic. But let's say that you've got someone who really enjoys both sports and they're a bit more recreational. Maybe the pinnacle of achievement for them is like a 10 times body weight super total, where they can do all 5 lifts or something like that. If that was the pinnacle of the sport for you and that was what you wanted to achieve, how would you go about training to get there?
Okay, cool. So this is a much better question. That, yeah, the reason why is because, like, what your idea is and my idea of it, I suppose, is different, because we spoke a little bit about business mission, right? Like, so, in terms of excellence, or levels of excellence. So if that is the person's goal, and 100% achievable, right? Um, you're probably gonna have to accept that it may be a long process. I would say, in terms of the how, I would say that the person will probably have to start weightlifting. It's 100% easier to transition from weightlifting to powerlifting, which is why when I have my school kids in here, I always just coach them for weightlifting only, because essentially, if they pull well, if they have good positions on the squat, that's two-thirds of the lifts done already. If they have good shoulder stability, not necessarily mobility, but good shoulder stability, um, bench wouldn't be that hard. Essentially, it's just like different muscle groups, but the stability and shoulder health would be there already. So I would say how uh, a lot of your investment in terms of training should be in weightlifting. Okay, and I would perhaps just change a little bit of the instead of pulls, I just do deadlifts. Perhaps the way you squat, depending on your body leverages, it might be similar anyway. So if it's a similar way, like for example, if you've got like a long torso, short femur kind of person, they're probably squatting the same way for weightlifting as they do for powerlifting. And then I'll just add bench, here and there. If you're a female, I mean, bench, you probably need to bench like 3 to 4 times a week, which will be a lot more difficult in terms of balancing your training. Um, but yeah, I would just say like maybe two-thirds of your training will be weightlifting. That's super super generic thing to say. I shouldn't say that, but but if I were to start somewhere, I'd be like weightlifting two-thirds of the time, and then powerlifting. But the person that I did coach um, to both, she was a powerlifter first. She just so happened to have one the leverages. So like I said, like tall, long torso, you know, and she'd always had front squats in her programs. Her squats are not very hingy. It's quite an upright squat already. So, like in terms of the squat pattern, when we do the snatch and clean and jerk, it's fine. Her overhead mobility was also kept intact. So what that meant was like she just had this excess strength that she had to transfer over. So like before she transferred over, she was front squatting like 145, right? Before she transferred over, she was already like back squatting like 180. So when she just did it, it wasn't that hard to teach to clean. Like she'll clean like 100 within like 4 weeks, right? Like you get what I'm trying to say? Yeah, like there's just the hardware is already there, and the software was easy to teach because she's also like quite an athletic person. Not like the classic power lifter, so to speak, like more of the like a rich history of like sports behind her as well. So quite a unique situation.
Oh, awesome. I really love that. I guess segueing from the mixture of the two sports into understanding powerlifting, understanding weightlifting a little bit more specifically, what do you think it is in your experience? Obviously you teach school kids all the way up to people that have won world championships and events like those. What do you think it is that keeps people moving through what they need to move through to get to those highest levels? Like when you watch people train, what is it about their bodies? What is it about their mindset? What is it about their relationship with themselves or with you? Like, are there any things that you would really identify help people continue to grow over time as things get harder?
Um, Sorry. So are you asking for like specific traits? Is that what you're?
But potentially traits, like, are there any things that you would say, oh, yeah, like, for example, the national champion in both, or, Carlina or someone like that? Are there certain things that you kind of see day one or as you go through training people? You're like, oh, yeah, this is something I definitely see more often than not when someone's going to go a long way versus,
Ah,
when someone
okay.
ends up disappearing quite soon after they start.
Okay. The question is talent identification, right? Basically, it's like to identify. Yeah, like oh, how
Maybe
quickly I can tell. Like
maybe talent identification, but also like I think you could have a lot of people who are quite average. You could have a lot of average people walk in, right? So you've got your top echelon, you've got the people that are probably not going to last long, and it's very obvious from the start. But there's a whole bunch in the middle, and I suspect that within this whole bunch in the middle, there are some that end up training a lot longer than you maybe would have expected, and they end up achieving a lot more than you maybe would have initially expected. And then within that same group, there's actually a lot of people you're like, okay, well, you fell off a lot faster than I would have thought, or maybe I thought there'd be a bit more coming from you. I'm just wondering, as someone who has coached a number of people, what is it that keeps people going? What is it that keeps people achieving? Like, what elements are there in a person, if there is anything that you can say is relatively generic, that actually gets more out of them than you would expect?
Okay. I like to think I understand the question. So number one, there's there's you have like the people in the middle, right? Like, and then kind of getting further. Um, this comes internally, all right. But basically, the mission is again like to provide a platform to overachieve, which is essentially what you're suggesting, right? Like, oh, I felt like this person, I never saw that this person
Yeah,
would
exactly. You've
be,
nailed it. Yeah.
someone or whatever, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is, um, my process is intrinsic in the sense that I would coach them as though they were gonna become world champions, anyways, right? Like, even if they walk in here as a peasant, I would coach them as though they'll one day become a king or a queen or something like that,
Mhm.
right? So the mission, because internally the mission is the same, right? I wouldn't vary like how I would coach someone. Um, Obviously, different starting points is evident, right? Like someone walk in here deadlift 200 already, and like and you might start further on your process. But one thing that I wouldn't do is I wouldn't necessarily. I used to. I wouldn't necessarily identify talent in that sense that like I'd be like, oh, you're gonna be someone. I used to do that.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm gonna invest more in you. I'm gonna change my process because I think you're gonna be someone. And then, like you said, like they might just fall off and might lose interest and all that. Like I just coach people as though they want to be someone.
Yeah.
And I know I'm using the term loosely. You're gonna be somebody
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever it may be, but I'm just gonna presume that they're gonna be excellent at some point. Um, in terms of traits, I just stopped looking, I suppose. But what I will say is, obviously, the gym is also, the team is also very value driven. Like, you would have looked through my website, right? So the values of industriousness, discipline, accountability, patience. Those are some of the values that obviously we try to uh, portray, or like we try to live by when we train and as a culture here. And in theory, even though someone comes in without those traits, in theory, like through the culture, they will develop those traits. And I would say that like your I'm guessing your question was like, oh, do I see those traits in other people? Is that what dictates how far they go, essentially, or how I predict how far they go? I mean, the reason why those values are there, and the values are so prominent in the team and in the culture, is because I have seen them in my experience, like in excellent lifters, right? So, for example, right, like those values weren't always there from the beginning, from the inception of the team, right? Like I started coaching people, they started excelling, and the people that were excelling showed traits of accountability, discipline, industriousness, so on and so forth. That I'm like, maybe those are the traits, and instead of looking for those traits on individuals, I would say maybe we should instill those values and traits into the culture of the team, so that individuals that may lack those things will eventually develop them, um, and yeah, maybe find a way to develop them for themselves in the future, and through that, then excel in the sport. Does that Did I portray, or did I answer your question well?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. I guess like the simplest way to ask that question would have been like, obviously, you're about being a platform to overachieve. What would I have to do to be an overachiever? And you've said those things there, which is kind of what I was looking for. So yeah, you definitely answered that question well. Thank you for that. I guess the other thing I'd really love to hear is, obviously that's the overachieving side of things, and not everyone overachieves that comes into this gym, I'm sure. So what are the common things that you would say end up having people stop their journey sooner than being an overachiever? What kind of problems are the really, really common ones that you see people run into? what kind of roadblocks stop people? Do you think it is just like a lack of discipline and a lack of accountability and all of these things, just the opposite? Or do you think that there are genuine things where you're like, oh, okay, well, I can see that this is not a good step in the right direction. I think we're going the wrong way now. Are there any common traits or issues that you see people have when they start to end up, um, I guess, straying from that overachieving path?
I wouldn't say common. I would say it's very individual, right? Everyone's got different lives, different challenges in their lives. Um, what I would say is that basically the bus is going this way, right? The team is going this way. You can get hop on and off the bus, right? Depending on where you are with your life and the challenges you're facing in your life. And normally, it's about priorities. Um, and priorities changing, and that's fine too. Like this sport doesn't have to be for life. We'd like to think it is, but it doesn't have to be. You could be in uni and you could be pretty okay with your studies and have some spare time and enjoy lifting and want to reach as much as you can or achieve as much as you can at that time. And then you hit the workforce and then you say, I actually want to grind in terms of my career, and I want to apply a lot of the lessons that I learned from lifting towards my career, whether it be industriousness, accountability, discipline, and all whatnot. I want to apply that to my career, and I'm like, okay, that's cool, and that's not a sad thing, right? Like, because the question seemed to have been framed like, oh man, it's sad, like people lose it, stop their journey, but part of the journey is the end. That's Iron Man, right? Um, and that's fine too. That's okay. You don't have to lift forever. I know some coaches want to preach, oh, we got to lift for life, and all that kind of stuff. Doesn't have to be that way. And priorities in life change. Like for myself as a coach, like I stay up late nights, and that's not great for me as an athlete, right? Like if I'm training and like I have a heavy day after, but I have my priorities are to get my work done and whatnot, and that's the same for a lot of other people. And it's not like a lack of discipline or a lack of accountability, although that happens too. Um, Honestly, I just think it's priorities. And one of the things that I actually learned uh, from a marketing standpoint, which is also a little bit of my background, is like knowing what your target market is, right? Like, so my target market probably is the people that have lifting as a top three priority in life. Top four is a little bit, shaky. But if lifting is top three in your priority in life, uh, this is probably the place for you. But if it's not, and that's fine too. Kind of like what you were saying, like like recreational lifters, and that's fine too. There's a different space for you for that, and that's kind of what's great with powerlifting is there's a lot of coaches now because of that culture of like coaches sharing information. That there's plenty of spaces for plenty of people with different missions and want to get different things out of lifting. But for the team, it's the top three priority in life kind of situation. And if that's the case and that's you, then you're here. You're on the bus essentially, or like you're. And then when that changes, and then lifting becomes further away from your priorities, and typically people step away, and that's not a sad thing for me. Essentially, it's just the way it is, and and that's okay. Just people move on in life, and like kind of like what we spoke about as well is like as coaches, we'll be fired more than any other employed person. You're not gonna coach someone for life. You'll lose everyone that you've ever coached eventually, and you're just gonna have to accept that. And it doesn't have to be sad. It can just be like a okay, your journey's finished. See you later, or like I'll come across you in the street and whatnot.
Oh, that's really cool. I guess one last question I'd like to finish up with, a nice simple one. But what is strength? What does being strong mean to you?
This is tough question. Um, in truth, I want to say something inspirational. Um, but because this is a strength sports content, I will say it's about the kilos in the bar. It's about the total. It really is. It's a lot of the intangible stuff matter a lot to add to your kilos in the bar. But the game, or how put this, the game that we play have a scoreboard, and the scoreboard, the total is represented on the scoreboard. Um, if you're I'm a sports coach. I'm not a recreational coach, right? Meaning the sport, there's a there's a scoreboard and the total matters. And to be honest, the total matters the most. If you total more, in terms of like, obviously like weight classes and whatnot, that's what matters the most, and that's what makes you strong, no matter what anyone says, right? And that's, I guess, what's cool about the sport also is because at the end of the day, it's not about any other thing. It's not subjective. It's not like, oh, but that person's got like more followers, or that person's got nicer technique, or that person's like a kinder person, or whatever. No, no, no. The scoreboard is about the total. And being a sports coach, that's what strength means to me with regards to the context of strength sports coaching.